The lecture hall on Soleni Prime could hold 200 students, and was almost always full. It was not the largest teaching room at the Academy of Accord Studies. It was not even in the main building. It sat in one of the older wings, where the corridors had low ceilings, and the light came through long narrow windows in warm horizontal bars. But the course that ran inside it every semester had a waiting list 3 years deep, and the students who managed to get a seat told the ones who did not that it was the best thing they had ever sat through, and the ones who did not believed them, because the person who taught it was Tikarak. She was older now. The pale fur had gone lighter around her face, and her movements had taken on the careful precision of someone who had stopped being in a hurry about things. But her eyes were the same as they had always been. Dark, fast, catching everything in the room before most people had finished walking into it. Into the hall, on the first day of the new semester, without ceremony, and stood at the front, and looked at the rows of young faces, looking back at her. Sorvakin and Vreth and Ulari descended, and a handful of species she did not immediately recognize, which pleased her, and she said, without any introduction at all, "Tell me what you already know about humans." What followed was the usual collection of answers she had come to expect over the 30 years she had taught this course. Someone said, most technologically advanced civilization in the Accord. Someone said they were the patient ones from the old pre-Accord archive records. A young Sorvakin in the third row, neat, serious, the kind of student who had read everything before the first class and wanted it known, said they concealed their capabilities for approximately 140 years before the Karath incident forced disclosure, and their admission as full members 30 years ago fundamentally restructured the Accord's governance model in ways that are still being measured. Tik Arak pointed at him. That is the what, she said. This course is about the why, which is a much more interesting question and considerably harder to answer. She moved to the display behind her. We are going to spend this semester asking why a civilization that could have walked into the Galactic Accord and announced itself as the most powerful force in known space instead spent 140 years sitting on a bench near the door, pretending to struggle with the heating system. A few students laughed. Tekarak did not. It is a genuine question, she said, and I want you to sit with it before you assume you already know the answer, because everyone who hears this story for the first time thinks they know the answer, and almost all of them are wrong. She began at the beginning. She showed them the UES Meridian in old archive footage, a plain, modest vessel, nothing remarkable about it, docking in the outermost berth of Solen Reach between two ships that dwarfed it on both sides. And she showed them Ambassador Lyra Chen walking down the boarding ramp with the worn satchel and the practiced blink of someone encountering the size of the universe for the first time. I was there, Tikarak said. I was a junior researcher with no particular reason to notice the humans at all. I had a study to complete, a schedule to keep, and a very full notebook. She paused, and I could not stop watching them. She showed them the Varath Nebula mission, the reactor alarm, the 47 minutes, Marcus O'Yelleran washing his hands at the corner sink with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fixed a small and minor problem. And she showed them Vora's face on the security recording as she looked at the stable readings, and then looked at Marcus, and then looked at the readings again. The students watched that loop in silence for a moment. She showed them the archive file, the explorer's account, 11,000 years old, the physical description, the last line, and she let the room read it slowly. She showed them the grand chamber, the moment the corrected KGI score appeared on the main display, the verification system reading the number 3 times, the chamber going still and then loud, Stetsavan's face in the senior tier doing something complicated that his face was not accustomed to doing. She showed them Lyra standing alone in the center of the floor, satchel over one shoulder, saying, "We wanted to remember what it felt like to be curious about things instead of certain about them." The young Sorvakin in the third row, his name was Aaron, she had already made a note of it, raised his hand partway through the session. "Professor," he said, and his tone was careful, the tone of someone who had a real question and had thought about whether to ask it. "If they were always the most powerful, if they had the capability the whole time, weren't they lying to everyone?" He paused. "I am not asking it as a criticism. I mean it genuinely. Deception, by definition, creates an unfair situation. Isn't that harmful regardless of the reason?" Tikarak looked at him. "That is the question," she said. "That is exactly the question I have been waiting for someone in this room to ask." She moved to the front of the display and turned to face the whole hall. "What is honesty for?" No one answered immediately. "We value honesty because trust matters," she said. "And trust matters because it is the ground that cooperation grows in. And cooperation matters because no species, however large and however capable, thrives entirely alone. That is not sentiment, it is observable fact, across every civilization we have ever studied." She looked at Aaron. "So the question is not whether humans were deceptive. They were. The question is what the deception was built to protect." She let that sit. "They did not hide their power to take advantage of us," she said. "They hid it to protect us from the version of this first meeting that would have happened if we had known. And I want you to think carefully about what that version would have looked like." She did not give them the answer directly. She never did in this course. She walked them through the record piece by piece, the way she had walked students through it for 30 years. The rigid hierarchy of the old Accord, the ranking systems, the way senior species had quietly held outcomes in place, while the structures of shared governance existed mostly as decoration. And then she showed them what the Accord looked like 30 years after humanity's full admission. Species that had been in observer status for decades with full voting rights at last, not because humanity had demanded it, but because humanity's presence had made the old justifications impossible to maintain. Infrastructure programs that had never been approved. Research partnerships between species that had never exchanged a direct word, formed. Boundary dispute processes that had been stalled for generations, moving. She showed them the Dorkai Collective 15 years after the Karath incident, stable, integrated, one of the most active participants in the Accord's mediation programs. And she told them what Lyra had said when the asylum request was handed to her. They made a mistake, that is allowed, and she moved on. A civilization that understood itself as the most powerful thing in the room would have handled the Dorkai situation differently, Tikarak said, would have made a demonstration, would have established the hierarchy clearly so that no one would try it again. She shook her head. Instead they said, "Forgive the mistake and bring them in." They could say that so easily was because they had made the same mistake themselves a long time ago, and someone had given them the space to recover from it. She paused. Or at least that is what Lyra Chen told me, in her cabin on Selen Reach, on the night the Dorkai fleet went quiet. The room was very still. After the session, Aaron fell into step beside her in the corridor. "Professor," he said, "you said the deception was built to protect us from how we would have behaved if we had known. And I understand the argument. But it still feels like they made a decision for us about what we could handle. Like they looked at us and decided we were not ready for the truth. Isn't that its own kind of disrespect?" Tikarak stopped walking. She looked at him, the same careful, direct look she had given Lyra Chen in the observation lounge of the Keth Sorvan 40 years ago, when she had first said, "You are not what you say you are." Said, "You are right. It is. And I have argued exactly that with Lyra Chen more than once over the years, and she has never fully disagreed with me. She has always said, 'You are not wrong, and we made the call anyway,' and I am not entirely at peace with that." Aaron was quiet. "But here is what I will tell you," Tikarak said, and they started walking again. The most powerful being I have ever met, in 60 years of work, spent 140 years sitting near the door, asking basic questions, and pretending to be confused. Not because she was afraid of us, not because she wanted something from us, but because she thought we were worth the wait. She glanced at him. I have met a great many powerful people in my career, Aaron. I have not met many who thought that about anyone but themselves. He walked beside her in silence for a moment. Is she still alive? He asked. She is, Tikarak said. Retired, she lives on Earth, told, and reads a great deal and occasionally writes letters to people she met 50 years ago. She reached into her coat and took out a very small, very worn notebook, the same one she had carried since the Verath Nebula, and she opened it to the last page, where a short message had been written in neat small handwriting. She held it out. Aaron read it slowly. Standard was his third language, and Lyra's handwriting was precise but very small. Remember when we pretended we weren't the most developed species in the galaxy? He read aloud. Tell them it was the best decision we ever made, and that the second best was trusting that you would all eventually figure it out. He looked up from the notebook. Tikarak took it back and tucked it carefully into her coat. That is the whole course, she said. Right there in 2 sentences. But since we have a full semester and a great deal of ground to cover, we are going to take our time with it. Turned at the end of the corridor. Be here on Thursday, she said, and she walked away into the warm, barred light of the old wing's long windows. Somewhere, very far away, on a pale and ordinary world orbiting an unremarkable star, in a room full of old people who had spent large parts of their lives in places they had pretended to be new to, someone laughed at something someone else had said, and someone refilled a cup, and someone by the window looked out at a sky they had known for 100 years and still found worth looking at. And someone said, the way people say things that have been funny for a long time and will be funny for a long time still. Remember when we pretended we weren't the most developed species in the galaxy? And every single one of them smiled. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Accord had seen many things in 3,000 years. It had seen the signing of the original Accord document, when 12 species who had been fighting each other for centuries put their marks on the same piece of material and chose with great difficulty and no real certainty to try something different. It had seen the formal end of 2 interstellar wars, the admission of 19 species to full membership, and the removal of 3 others under circumstances nobody particularly liked to talk about. It had seen speeches that changed the direction of whole civilizations, and votes that ended them. But it had never been quiet the way it was quiet now. Every seat was filled. The Sorvakine in their senior tier at the top, the Dorkai delegation in the restricted lower section reserved for parties under formal review. The smaller species packed into every available space. The observer-class representatives pressed against the back walls, and at the center of the circular floor under the main light stood one human woman in a plain gray uniform, with a worn satchel over one shoulder. Ambassador Lyra Chen had walked in alone. No advisors, no legal staff, no security detail, no diplomatic team standing behind her in a carefully arranged show of unity. Just her, and the satchel, and the kind of stillness that takes a very long time to learn and cannot be faked. High Arbiter Thesivan looked down at her from the senior tier. His expression was controlled. His hands were very still on the arms of his chair. When the chamber was formally called to order, he spoke in the measured tone of someone beginning a proceeding that history would later have opinions about. Ambassador Chen, he said, this emergency session has been called in response to the incident in the Karath system. The unexplained neutralization of the Dorkai fleet by parties as yet unidentified. Requested to speak to this matter, and any relevant context the human delegation wishes to provide. Thank you, High Arbiter, Lyra said. Her voice was clear and warm, and carried easily to every corner of the chamber, without any effort at all. She reached into the worn satchel. She removed a small data card. She walked to the chamber's central display terminal, and placed the card in the reader. A simple action, unhurried, like someone putting a book on a shelf, and the main display screen above her lit up with a document. "Before I speak to the Karath incident," she said, "I would like to submit a correction to Earth's Kardashev Galactic Index filing." The chamber was already quiet, but it became a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when a very large number of beings simultaneously understand that something is about to happen that they did not anticipate. "Our submitted score was 1.4, Lyra said. That figure was not accurate. She looked up at the screen. "Earth's actual KGI score is now available for all members to review." A pause. Then the Accord's automated verification system read the number aloud in standard for the official record. It read it once, then again, then a third time. The system was designed to repeat unconfirmed data until verification was complete, and by the third reading, several delegates in the upper tiers were already on their feet, and the sound in the chamber was no longer anything like quiet. Thesavon did not stand. He sat perfectly still and looked at the number on the display, and his expression was not anger, it was not outrage, it was not the face of a powerful person who has been deceived and wants to make that known. It was something much quieter and much harder to describe. The expression of someone watching something they had always assumed was the floor reveal itself to be the ceiling. The Accord's verification. Officer, a small, methodical being named Erath who had held the role for 40 years and prided himself on having seen everything, was running cross-checks in real time against observable astronomical data, computing infrastructure signatures, energy consumption patterns, and 17 additional metrics, and every single check was returning the same confirmation. The number was real. "Ambassador Chen," Thesavon said, and his voice was controlled, but something under it was not. "This figure would place Earth's civilization beyond the current upper boundary of the index. That boundary exists because no known civilization has ever reached." "We know," Lyra said, simply, without apology. "That is why we submitted the incorrect figure. We did not want to cause alarm before we understood this community well enough to trust it with the truth." The chamber erupted. It took several minutes to bring it back to order, entirely silent in a way that suggested very rapid internal calculations were happening, and several of the smaller observer-class species were looking toward the human bench with expressions that ranged from complete confusion to something that looked very much like relief, as though a weight they had not known they were carrying had just been named. When the chamber was quiet again, Lyra stood in the same place she had been standing the entire time. She had not moved, not to defend herself, not to address any one part of the noise, not to hold up her hands for calm. She had just stood in the center of the floor and let the room do what it needed to do, patient and unhurried, the way very deep water is patient. "I would like to explain," she said, quietly, when the room was ready, "if the chamber will allow it." Thesavon looked at her from the senior tier for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Humanity has been a spacefaring civilization for approximately 12,000 years, Lyra said. And the number landed in the chamber the way a large stone lands in still water, the effect moving outward in rings. In that time, we have made most of the same mistakes that any expanding civilization makes. We have fought wars over resources and territory and ideas. We have done damage that took centuries to repair. And at a certain point, several thousand years ago, we made a decision as a species." She paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the next part was the part that never translated easily into any language. "We chose to stop," she said. "Not forever, but we stepped back. We reduced our presence in deep space. We returned to a smaller footprint, and we spent several hundred years doing something that probably sounds strange." "What did you do?" asked Arath, not in an official capacity, just as someone who genuinely and completely needed to know. "We practiced being small again," Lyra said. "We wanted to remember what it felt like to be a young species, to be curious about things instead of certain about them, to need things instead of only providing them. And when we felt we understood ourselves again, we came back." She looked around the chamber, at the senior tiers, at the observer benches, at the Dorkai delegation sitting in careful silence. We came here the way we came here, as observers, as learners, because we did not want to enter this community as a dominant force. We wanted to join it as a member. She looked up at Festivan. We were not hiding from you. We were hiding from ourselves, from the version of us that would have walked through that door and handed everyone a ranking, instead of asking for a seat. The chamber was very still. We wanted to know what the galaxy was like before you knew what we were, she said. And we found something we did not entirely expect. The practiced smile was gone now. Face was simply hers. We found that it was very good, she said. HR. From the observer section near the back of the chamber, a small figure stood up. She was not the most senior person in the room. She was not close to it. And she spoke in the formal open address tone of the Accord's proceeding rules, steady and clear. I second the full admission of humanity to the Galactic Accord, said Tikarak, as a full member, with full rights, effective immediately. A pause. Then the small round delegation from the warm bread-smelling species stood too, all three of them, without discussion, as if they had already made the decision before they arrived. Then the Ulari representative, a softly glowing presence that rarely took formal positions on anything, made the deep resonant sound that served as its vote of agreement. Festivan sat at the top of the chamber and looked at Lyra Chen for a long time. Then he raised his hand and called for the formal vote. The vote was not close. The Dorkai delegation requested asylum before the session formally closed. Their lead representative stood in the restricted section and read a statement that was very short and entirely honest. They had targeted a human vessel because they believed it to be undefended. They had believed humanity to be a weak and uncomplicated target. They had been wrong in every possible way. They wished to formally withdraw all claims and requested the protection of the Accord pending renegotiation of their standing. Lyra did not comment publicly. When Rio passed her the formal request during the procedural close, she read it once and handed it back. Accepted, she said. All of it. She picked up her satchel from the floor. They made a mistake. That is allowed. Rio looked at her. That is very generous, he said. It is practical, she said. A civilization that cannot recover from a mistake it genuinely regrets is not one you want to keep around. The corridor outside the grand chamber was empty by the time Festivan found her. Most delegates had moved to the secondary rooms for the procedural follow-through, forms and confirmations, and the long administrative tale of a historic vote. And it was just the two of them in the quiet hall. He was tall, even without the formal context. She had known that, of course. But standing here with no chamber full of witnesses, and no tiers of rank arranged around him, he seemed simply like a very old person with very tired eyes. The patient ones, he said, not as a question, but the way people say something they have been turning over in their mind for hours and have finally decided to say aloud. That was really you? Lyra looked at him. We wondered when someone would finally look, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I found the file, he said. I buried it, said. And there was no accusation in her voice, nothing sharp or pointed. It was a great deal to process all at once. I understand that. He looked at her, a long, searching look, the kind that was trying to find the edge of something. Why did you trust that we would not simply destroy you when we found out? He asked. Lyra considered the question, honestly and without hurrying. We did not know for certain that you would not, she said. But we thought that a civilization that had lasted 3,000 years without destroying itself was probably capable of handling a surprise. She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. We were mostly right. Festivan looked at her for a moment longer. Then something happened to the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the shape one leaves behind. "You have been doing this for a very long time," he said. "Yes," Lyra said. "Was it worth it?" She looked at him, at the old eyes, and the silver bones, and the 3,000 years sitting behind him like a long shadow. "Ask me again, in 30 years, she said, and she turned and walked down the corridor. Behind her, Thesivon stood in the empty hall and watched her go. And for the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what came next. He found, to his considerable surprise, that the feeling was not entirely unpleasant. The Grand Archive of Selene Prime was the largest collection of recorded history in the known galaxy, a structure so old that parts of it predated the Accord itself. And Elder Mavu had worked inside it for 63 years, without ever being surprised by anything he found. He had read accounts of species that had eaten their own planets, civilizations that communicated through the deliberate collapse of stars, wars that had lasted longer than most species lived, and none of it had done more than prompt a careful note and a trip to the correct filing section. He was not the kind of person who stopped moving, but the file on his desk right now had made his hands go still. He sat in the dim reading light and read the words again from the beginning, slowly, making sure the translation was accurate. And when he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The document was 11,000 years old, species with no recorded name. The file had come up during a routine deep archive scan, a process the archive ran every 50 years to check the condition of its oldest records, and it had been flagged automatically because its original classification had degraded to an unreadable state, and no current category matched its contents. Mavu had pulled it from the flagged list, expecting damage or simple duplication. Instead, he had found a field record written by an unnamed Sorvakine explorer from the very early period of their deep space expansion. And what the explorer had written was not simple. He had found a world. The beings on it were medium-sized, bipedal, soft-skinned, with 2 forward-facing eyes, and a bilateral symmetry that the explorer described as unremarkable. And at first glance, he had written exactly that. They are nothing special at first look. But he had kept writing. He described a species that moved through deep space the way others moved through their own cities, without urgency, without wonder, because for them it was simply where they lived. And he described what they had built. Energy collection arrays, circling 3 separate stars. Materials processing stations, the size of small moons. And, on one occasion, the explorer had witnessed personally from a careful distance the full and deliberate disassembly of an uninhabited moon to use as raw material for a structure whose purpose the explorer could not determine. He described their ships as enormous and fast in ways his own instruments struggled to record accurately. He described their behavior as calm and patient and oddly gentle. He had written, "They answer our questions carefully, like adults with children, but not unkindly. They seemed genuinely pleased that we asked." The final line of the account read, "They call themselves, in their own language, something that translates approximately as, the patient ones. Read the physical description 4 more times." Then he opened the standard Accord Observer intake file that Earth had submitted 14 months ago. Plain, modest, full of careful, humble language. And he placed the 2 documents side by side on his desk. He sat in the archive's deep quiet and looked at both of them for a very long time. The physical description in the 11,000-year-old explorer account was not similar to the profile of humanity. It was exact. He brought it to High Arbiter Thesivon in a private meeting, not through the formal report process, not as a council submission, just the 2 of them, in Thesivon's working office, with the documents displayed on the desk between them. Thesivon read the file without expression. When he finished, he was still for a moment, the particular stillness of a very powerful person, deciding what something means for them, before deciding what it means for everyone else. Explorers account from 11,000 years ago, he said. Yes, Mavu said. Written by a single individual operating alone at the edge of known space. Yes, but the physical description could describe any number of bilateral species we have encountered in the time since, Thesavon said. His voice was even and measured. The filing classification degraded for a reason. This record is fragmentary, unverified, and without corroborating sources. He closed the display with one hand. File it under historical anomalies and mark it low priority. Mavu looked at him for a moment. I could bring it to the full archive board for a proper... Mark it low priority, Thesavon said, and the conversation was over. The next morning, the file was reclassified, stamped unverified, and moved to a deep archive subfolder that received perhaps 3 visitors in any given decade. Tik-Arak had been working in the archive for 3 weeks by the time the file was moved. She had requested a research placement after returning from the Verath Nebula mission, citing a broad study on pre-Accord exploration patterns, and she had developed a habit of checking the archive's reclassification logs every morning, the way some people checked weather reports. She saw the file move at 6 in the morning. She pulled it before the access window closed. She read it in a narrow storage alcove between the filing stacks, sitting on the floor with her notebook on her knees and the document glowing on her small reader. And when she finished, she sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up and walked directly to the human delegation's residential wing. Lyra answered the door in her plain gray jacket, with a cup of something warm in one hand, and the general look of someone who had been awake for a while and was making reasonable peace with it. And when she saw Tik-Arak's face, her expression changed. Was very small, the change. But Tik-Arak had been studying this face for months. Something moved behind Lyra's eyes, not fear exactly, and not guilt. Something older than both of those, and considerably heavier, like a door that had been closed for a long time, was feeling the weight of a hand on the other side. "Where did you find that?" Lyra asked. Her voice was quiet and very steady. Tik-Arak held up the reader. "The reclassification log," she said. "Thesavon had it buried this morning. The patient ones. Is that you?" Lyra looked at the reader. Then she looked at Tik-Arak. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Close it behind you." They sat at the small desk in the narrow cabin, and Tik-Arak asked her questions, and Lyra answered some of them, and did not answer others. And the ones she did not answer, she said so plainly, without pretending the questions had not been asked, which Tik-Arak found own way more honest than most full answers she had received in her career. She was still asking questions when the alert came through. It was not a routine station signal. It was a priority channel notification, the kind that bypassed all standard communications and arrived simultaneously to the heads of every delegation on Solon Reach. And when Lyra's communicator lit up on the desk between them, she picked it up and read the message. Then she read it a second time. Then she set it down, with her hand still flat on top of it. "What is it?" Tik-Arak asked. Lyra turned the communicator so she could see the screen. 3 lines. Dorkai fleet engaged. Human colony vessel Meridian 7 targeted in Karath system. No distress signal received from vessel. Tik-Arak read it twice. "They attacked you?" she said, and her voice was genuinely confused, because the Dorkai were aggressive, but they were not reckless. They had always been careful about which targets they chose. They had always picked fights they were certain they could win. Why would they move on an observer-class vessel? It makes no sense strategically. "It makes complete sense," Lyra said, and her voice was different now, flat and very clear. "They think we are weak. That was always going to be the risk of this. We looked exactly like something you could move on without consequences." She stood and walked to the window, and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. Then she opened a secondary channel on her communicator and typed a short message to Earth Command. The message said, "They moved on Meridian 7. Authorization to respond is your decision. Standing by. She set the communicator on the windowsill and did not pick it up again. Tikarak watched her stand there, very still, very straight, and did not say anything. The reply from Earth Command came back in 40 seconds. Stand by. 2 hours passed. Tikarak sat in the chair by the desk, and Lyra stood or paced, or sat on the edge of the bunk, and they spoke about other things, about the archive, about the explorer's account, about what 11,000 years looked like from the inside. And the communicator on the windowsill did not make a sound. Then, just past the second hour, a different alert came through. This one station-wide, broadcast to every delegation on Selena Reach simultaneously. The Dorkai fleet in the Karath system had gone offline. Every ship, simultaneously, with no explanation and no warning. No weapons had been detected, no vessel had entered the system, no signal had preceded the event. The fleet was simply silent, and the silence was complete. Tikarak read the bulletin, and then looked at Lyra. Lyra was looking at the wall, not at anything specific, just looking, the way you look at something that has been finished. What did they do? Tikarak asked. They responded, Lyra said. That is not an answer. Lyra looked at her then, and it was the same honest look she had given her in the observation lounge on the Keth Sorvan, the night Tikarak first said, "You are not what you say you are." Except this time there was nothing behind it, that was performance. No, Lyra said, it is not. She picked up the communicator and sent one final message to Earth Command. Received crew of Meridian 7 status? The reply came. All crew safe, vessel undamaged, Dorkai did not complete approach. Lyra read it and set the communicator down very carefully. They are safe, she said, and for just a moment, something in her face was not the ambassador at all, but simply a person who had been holding a breath for 2 hours and had finally been allowed to let it go. Then she straightened up. Tomorrow there will be an emergency session of the full council, she said. I want you in that chamber, Tikarak. As a witness? As yourself, Lyra said. That will be enough. She looked at the window and the dark station outside it. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow, everything changes. The Veroth Nebula was beautiful in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not seen it. A great slow swirl of color and gas, stretching across several light years, shifting between deep purple and green, and the pale gold of something very old, burning very quietly. The research vessel Keth Sorvan, a pride of the Sorvakine science fleet, moved through the outer edge of the nebula on a 3-month mapping mission, and somewhere in its lower decks, in a small room that had been assigned to the human support team, Marcus Oyelaran was pretending to read a beginner's guide to stellar cartography. He was not a beginner. He held full certification for stellar cartography across 3 separate Earth classifications, had spent 4 years teaching advanced gravitational mapping at the Academy, and had personally charted a section of space 4 times larger than the Veroth Nebula during a survey mission that the Accord did not know had ever happened. Booklet was useful. It gave him something to look at while he listened to the ship. And right now, the ship was telling him something was wrong. He could hear it in the frequency of the reactor hum, a specific kind of uneven rhythm that most engineers would miss unless they had spent a long time listening for it. And he set the booklet down on his bunk and sat still for a moment, counting the intervals. Then he put it back up and kept reading. He gave it 6 hours. The alarm came exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes later, a sharp layered sound that filled every corridor of the Keth Sorvan at once. And within minutes, the ship's engineering team was running toward the lower reactor chamber, voices fast and clipped. Marcus set the booklet on his bunk and waited. He counted to 30, long enough for the Sorvakine engineers to assess the situation. Then he put on his plain gray coveralls and walked, at a casual pace, in the direction of the reactor. The corridor outside the chamber was crowded, 6 engineers in full technical gear, 3 officers, and a senior scientist named Vora, who was looking at a data screen with the expression of someone doing complex and very unpleasant mathematics in her head. 14 hours, Vora said to the officers. Possibly 18 if the secondary coupling has compromised the tertiary ring. We will need to reduce speed and reroute power from the observation systems. One of the officers noticed Marcus standing at the edge of the group. This corridor is restricted to technical personnel, the officer said. Not rudely, just the practiced tone of someone managing a crisis and not wanting extra things to manage. Of course, sorry, Marcus said. He looked appropriately apologetic, a man who had gotten turned around. I heard the alarm, and was not sure which way to go. Could you point me back toward the support quarters? Vora glanced at him. The same fast, careful eyes as Tikarak, Marcus noticed, and she looked back at her screen. Then she looked at him again. What are you doing? She asked. Not hostile, just precise. Nothing, Marcus said, and then because he'd learned that the best lies were the ones that felt unnecessary, he added, Actually, I do not want to overstep, but that sound coming from the secondary coupling, we had something a bit like it on one of our training vessels back home. I am probably completely wrong, our ships are much simpler, but I noticed the interval, and it reminded me of something. Vora looked at him fully now. Something in her expression shifted, not toward trust, but toward the specific attention of a scientist who has heard something unexpected. What did you observe? She asked. Marcus scratched the back of his neck, a gesture he had practiced, the body language of someone uncertain and slightly embarrassed. Screen. And, may I? He asked. 47 minutes later the reactor was fixed. Vora stood in the corridor with her engineering team and looked at the stable readings. Secondary coupling clean, tertiary ring completely undamaged, everything running evenly. And then she looked at Marcus, who was washing his hands at the small corner sink and looking mildly pleased with himself in the manner of someone who had simply gotten lucky. You said your training vessels had something similar, she said. Something a bit like it, Marcus said. Not exactly the same. Your system is much more advanced than anything we have. I just noticed a pattern that looked familiar. The counter-rotation method you used, Vora said. Her voice was careful now, the voice of someone quietly storing information. Where did you learn it? I read about it, Marcus said, in one of your older technical archives, the ones you made available to observer species. A lot in my free time. He gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. Not much else to do on a long transit. Vora held his gaze. Then she looked at her team, and back at him, and back at the stable readings. Thank you, she said. The method was effective. I'm glad it helped, Marcus said. I hope I did not get in the way. He smiled, warm, slightly bumbling, completely harmless, and excused himself to get dinner. Tikarak had watched all of it from the upper observation rail. She had been heading to equipment storage on the far side of the reactor level when the alarm sounded, and she had stopped and pressed herself against the wall and watched, very quietly, very carefully, the way she watched everything. She had her notebook out before Vora finished saying thank you. She wrote quickly, radiation tolerance, day 9 observation, human support team member remained in close proximity to open reactor housing for 22 minutes with no shielding, no apparent distress at any point. She wrote, counter-rotation method, not present in any archive accessible to observer species. Checked full catalog before boarding this vessel. This method does not exist in any document we gave them. She wrote, hands steady throughout the repair. Voice tone and movement consistent with normal heart rate. No signs of stress or uncertainty at any point during a task that had our senior engineering team visibly alarmed. She drew a long line under all of this and wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page. The humans are lying. She underlined it twice. Then she looked at the empty space where Marcus had been standing, and she wrote a second line beneath the first. Find out why. She found Lyra that evening in the shared observation lounge. a long curved room near the top of the ship, where the nebula filled the entire ceiling in shifting color, and sat down beside her. Without asking, Lyra was looking up at the light with a relaxed, slightly dreamy expression. She looked completely at ease. Tikarak was no longer sure that anything on Lyra Chen's face was completely at ease. "You are not what you say you are," Tikarak said. Quietly, flat, not an accusation, just a fact she was placing on the table between them. There was a pause, short, barely a breath, and then Lyra turned her head and looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The nebula moved above them, in slow waves of gold and purple. "Neither are you, Tikarak," Lyra said. Her voice was the same warm, careful voice she always used, but something underneath it was different, something that had not been there in the formal sessions on Solen Reach. "But we are all playing the game, aren't we?" It was not quite a question. Tikarak stared at her. Lyra turned back to the nebula and said nothing more. Colored light, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face quiet and open. After a while she stood, said good night in her usual gentle way, and left. Tikarak sat in a lounge for a long time after that, alone with the nebula, and the low hum of the ship, and the small notebook in her hands. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote a title at the top, in careful, precise letters. "The humans are lying, and I want to know why." She looked at it for a long time. Then she added a line beneath it. "Lyra Chen knows that I know, and she is not afraid. That is either confidence or something much larger than confidence." She closed the notebook and tucked it inside her coat, where no one would find it. She did not sleep much that night. The rest of the mapping mission passed without incident, at least on the surface of things. Marcus attended 3 more technical briefings, asked modest questions, and twice offered small observations that the engineering team found unexpectedly useful. Each time with the same shrug, the same mention of a training vessel, the same expression of a person who had simply been in the right place at the right time. Vora began greeting him in the corridors. The other engineers started making space for him at the briefing tables. None of them said anything about it directly. The Sorvakin did not do things directly as a rule, but there was a shift in how they moved around him, the way you move around something you are not yet sure how to classify. Tikarak documented all of it. She documented the moment a junior engineer asked Marcus how he had learned to read structural resonance, and Marcus said he had picked it up from some old manuals. She documented the afternoon a navigation officer asked him a question about long-range drift correction, and Marcus answered it in about 4 seconds, and then immediately followed the answer with, "But I am sure your instruments are more reliable than my guess." She documented the fact that his guess was exactly correct, verified 2 hours later by the ship's own systems. On the last day of the mission, as the Keth Sorvan turned back towards Solen Reach, Tikarak sat in her small cabin and looked at everything she had written, and thought about what it added up to. She thought about what Lyra had said. "We are all playing the game, aren't we?" And she thought about what kind of game required a civilization to be something so much less than it was. And she thought that whatever the reason was, it must be a very good one. Because the alternative, that a species as capable as this had spent over 100 years pretending to be small for no reason at all, was not something she was willing to believe. She turned to a new page in her notebook. She wrote, "I am going to find the answer." Then she wrote, "I think Lyra Chen is going to let me." The ship moved through the dark like a quiet thought, steady and slow, and carrying a secret big enough to shake the stars. Ambassador Lyra Chen stood at the wide viewing window of the UES Meridian and watched the galaxy drift past outside, vast and ancient and completely unaware of what was sitting inside this small, plain Earth vessel. She was not a small person in any real sense. She was sharp, composed, and had spent 11 years studying every known species in the Galactic Accord. But right now, she was doing her very best impression of someone who found everything slightly overwhelming. She blinked at the stars like they were new to her. They were not new to her at all. Behind her the ship hummed, a low, familiar sound that felt like breathing. And she turned from the window when she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her. 20 minutes to docking, Ambassador, said Lieutenant Ryo Tanaka, young, precise, and holding the data tablet that never seemed to leave his hands. Thank you, Ryo, Lyra said, her voice soft and a little uncertain, the voice she used when she wanted to sound like someone who was still learning the rules of things. Ryo looked at her for a moment. He had worked with her long enough to know the difference between her real face and her diplomatic face, and right now the diplomatic face was on so completely that even he felt a small flicker of doubt. "Ready?" he asked. She gave him a small, slightly nervous smile, one she had rehearsed until it sat perfectly on her face. "I hope they're friendly," she said. Ryo almost laughed, but only almost, because in 20 minutes they would be on a Sorvakine station, and nothing about the months ahead would be a joke. The Galactic Accord was not a young thing. It had existed for over 3,000 years, built slowly by species who had learned the hard way that war between star systems was ruinously expensive. Never worth what it cost, but to humanity, at least officially, it was all new and exciting and slightly intimidating. Earth had submitted its formal application for observer status 14 months ago, a carefully written document full of humble language about hope and learning and the desire to be welcomed into a larger family. And the Accord had accepted with the kind of gentle warmth that powerful groups tend to show toward those they consider harmless. That was exactly what Earth's Strategic Council had been counting on. Every member of the diplomatic team had been briefed in the lower rooms of the Meridian. In sessions that lasted for days, humanity would present itself as a young species, curious and moderately advanced, but nothing remarkable, still figuring out what the stars even were. The Kardashev Galactic Index, the ranking system the Accord used to measure every known civilization, would show humanity at a score of 1.4. Them just barely above the Vreth, a scent-based species that had not yet discovered fusion power, and just below the Ulari, who were technically a gas-based intelligence and whose ranking had been debated for centuries. Earth's real KGI score was not written in any document that the Accord would ever be permitted to read. Solen Reach was enormous, a docking ring the size of a small moon, wrapped in light and metal, and the noise of 100 different vessels from 100 different worlds, and when the Meridian arrived, it was directed to its assigned berth in the outermost ring. The outermost ring was where the unimportant ones docked. Lyra walked down the boarding ramp in her plain gray uniform, a worn satchel on one shoulder, her face open and slightly awed. She looked up at the ceiling of the docking bay like she had never seen anything so impressive in her life. In truth, she had personally been involved in the construction of 3 structures that were considerably larger. She did not mention this. The welcome party was led by High Arbiter Thesavon of the Sorvakine, tall, silver-boned, dressed in layered robes that shifted color when he moved, looking at Lyra the way a mountain might look at a pebble that had recently learned to talk. "Ambassador Chen," he said, his translator working in smooth standard, "welcome to the Galactic Accord. The universe is very large, and we are glad that you have at last found your way to us." Lyra smiled wide, grateful, awed, just a little overwhelmed. "High Arbiter," she said, "we are so honored. Your station is more magnificent than anything we imagined." Thesavon smiled, the smile of someone who had received exactly this kind of reaction before, and found it pleasant, and he gestured for them to follow, and turned away, already speaking to someone else. Humanity had been acknowledged, and that was apparently sufficient for the moment. Fell in beside Lyra, as they walked the gleaming corridors of the station. surrounded by aliens who moved with the unhurried confidence of civilizations built across millennia. "You said magnificent," he murmured. "I thought we were saving that one for the Grand Chamber." "Thessavan needed it more," she whispered back, not moving her lips. Ryo made a small note on his tablet and said nothing further. The first formal session for new observers was held in a tiered circular chamber, the older species seated near the top where the light was best, the newer arrivals arranged in a descending ring based entirely on their KGI scores, and humanity was directed to a curved bench near the very bottom, close to the door, beside a delegation of small round beings who smelled faintly of warm bread. Lyra sat down and folded her hands and looked up at the rings of alien faces looking down at her. Some were curious, most were bored, a few did not seem to register that humanity was there at all. Lyra made her face do something very difficult. She made it look like she was exactly where she belonged. The proceedings were long. Officials explained the rules of observer status in careful detail, a process that seemed designed mostly to remind newcomers how little they were permitted to do. And Lyra asked 3 questions during the open period, each one crafted to sound genuinely naive without crossing into insult. When a Dorkai official explained that observer species had no voting rights and could not speak in full council sessions without written permission submitted 48 hours in advance, Lyra nodded seriously and wrote in her small notebook. She was writing down a list of things she wanted to cook when she got home. It kept her expression from giving anything away. After the session ended, the delegates filed out in order of rank, Sorvakine first, then the other senior species, and the junior observers waited near the bottom of the chamber until the room had mostly cleared. That was when a small figure appeared beside Lyra. She was barely reaching Lyra's shoulder, covered in fine pale fur, with wide dark eyes that moved fast and seemed to catch everything in the room at once, and she was looking at Lyra with an expression that was not polite curiosity, but something sharper and more careful than that. "You are the human?" she asked. Her standard was quick and slightly rough, like someone who had learned it fast, and did not particularly care about accent. "I am," Lyra said. She smiled the warm, slightly uncertain smile. "Ambassador Lyra Chen, it is wonderful to meet you." "Tikarak," the small alien said. "Junior researcher, Vreth Science Division." She paused for just a beat. "Your power core configuration is interesting." Lyra blinked. The practice blink, the one that communicated gentle confusion. "Understand," she said. Tikarak looked at her for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable. "No," she said, "I am sure you do not." And then she turned and walked away, fast and precise, already pulling out a small notebook of her own. Ryo appeared at Lyra's elbow. "Was that?" he started. "Yes," Lyra said quietly. "Should we be concerned?" Lyra watched Tikarak disappear into the crowd of departing delegates. "Note her name," she said. "She is going to be important." That evening, in the small cabin assigned to her, positioned in the junior delegate wing, clean and modest, and just slightly too low-ceilinged for comfort, Lyra sat at the narrow desk and opened the secure channel back to Earth Command. She typed one message, no subject line, no explanation, no extra words. "They bought it. Phase 1 confirmed." She sent it and closed the channel and sat in the quiet. The station hummed around her, with the sounds of 1,000 years of conversations between civilizations. And she looked at her own hands, resting flat on the desk, and thought, as she sometimes did in these moments, about how strange it was to choose to be small. She was very good at it by now. She stood and straightened her plain gray jacket and went to find something to eat. Tomorrow, the work would begin.